We're delighted you're all here. Welcome to the Law School. Welcome to our inaugural lecture of our lecture series in honor of the 10th anniversary of the Disability Law and Policy Program. And most of all, welcome to Eric Rosenthal. I'm so happy he's here. I want to say it gives me great pleasure to welcome Eric to the College of Law and to introduce him. But first, let me thank a lot of people who made this possible: the Dean's Office for our lecture series, Robert Conrad for our publicity, Chris Ramsdell, who's still moving chairs at this hour, who is our logistic and administrative support. I want to thank all of our co-sponsors, which is always, I think, one of the joys of teaching at Syracuse University for me, which is that we don't operate alone, we are in a community. So I want to acknowledge the School of Education, Cultural Foundation of Education, the Beyond, you can clap when appropriate, the Beyond Compliance Coordinating Committee, the Disability Law Society, the Women and Gender Studies Department, the Honors Program, the Center of Human Policy Law Disability Studies, Fall College, the College of Arts and Sciences, and I hope I didn't forget anyone, but clearly the Disability Cultural Center, right here in front of me. And I also want to thank Joel Whitney, who's our tech brilliant genius here. So thank you all for being here. Thank all our co-sponsors, and most of all, thank you for our sign language interpreters, who remind us that we are all here together. There are two reasons why I'm happy to introduce Eric today and that he accepted our invitation. First, Eric Rosenthal is one of the world's leaders in the rights of people with disabilities internationally. In 1993, he founded Mental Disability Rights International, which is now called Disability Rights International, and you're going to hear more about it over the next hour. Since its founding, DRI has trained human rights and disability activists around the world, provided assistance to organizations and governments worldwide, even before anyone was talking about disability as a human rights issue, and long before the United Nations adopted the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities in 2006. Eric has conducted investigation and trained activists in more than 25 countries, and I listed them here. I won't, but many, many countries. And I've accompanied Eric on some of these study tours, and I can say firsthand that his passion, commitment, energy, focus, intellectual prowess, and sense of community that he instills in all of those who work with him. It seems to overcome language, cultural, and even ideological barriers. It's impressive. Eric has published reports about the atrocities to which people with disabilities are subjected in institutions, orphanages, and social care homes around the world. And these reports have brought worldwide attention to the rights of people with disabilities. I encourage you to read their reports all on the Disability Rights International website. Eric received his law degree cum laude from Georgetown, his BA from University of Chicago. He teaches and is taught at Georgetown and Washington College of Law. He's a board member and former vice president of the U.S. International Council on Disability, and he chaired the UCID committee working on the U.S. ratification of the CRPD, the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. In recognition for his accomplishment, Eric has received numerous awards. I've listed them all here. Let me just say he's received the Charles Bronfman Prize for humanitarian work, the Henry Betts Prize from the American Association of People with Disabilities. And I want to quote something that they said when they gave him that award, which is not only did he get it for his pioneering work in the field of international human rights advocacy, but in no small part was the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities itself due to Rosenthal's role promoting disability as a human rights issue. He's accepted other prizes at universities and other organizations. He's clearly a leader in the field of disability rights, so it's especially fitting, I think, that he joins us today as we celebrate this 10th anniversary of our own program, the Disability Law and Policy Program. And by the way, in 2016, it's the 10th anniversary of what else? Hello, my students. The Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities, which was adopted in 2006. But there's a second reason, and I'll be quick here. There's a second reason, though, why I'm personally delighted that Eric is here today. And that's because I hope that he can inspire you students, to dream big and to follow your dreams. He did, and he's here to tell you his story. I met Eric right after he finished college. He showed up at the door of the Mental Health Law Project, where I was working as a newbie attorney myself at that time, and he was deciding between psychology and law grad school. He said, "Can I work here? I'll do anything." And he did most everything, from helping on Supreme Court briefs with lawyers to answering phones and making Xerox copies, which also the lawyers did alongside him. When I remembered meeting with him and working with him, he recalled that he wanted to figure out a way to bring awareness internationally to the abuses of people with disabilities, kind of like an Amnesty International for people with disabilities. He had an idea, and with a minuscule amount of funding and a lot of chutzpah, as we say in my language, and energy and determination, he made it happen. With donated office space, a group of colleagues, he traveled around the world, started documenting abuse, and today disability rights is a human rights issue. We do not dispute that. But it wasn't back then. Eric and Len Rubenstein wrote an article in 1999 in the International Journal of Law and Psychiatry.
1991.
1991, thank you. International Journal of Law and Psychiatry. It was the first article that ever applied international legal principles to abuse of people with disabilities. So before that, it was not even discussed. He wrote that article. He started the movement, in my view. So people with disabilities themselves now are standing up for themselves, and I think that's one of the greatest accomplishments, perhaps, of our own Americans with Disabilities Act. But yet, there is a role for allies, and there's a role for people without disabilities to work with people with disabilities in trying to stop the abuse. Eric shows that. Even today, people who are locked away in institutions are prevented from speaking. They are invisible. They are considered less than human, including in the United States. People in institutions, orphanages, and other facilities are deprived not only of their liberty, but also the opportunity to simply be seen as human beings in the society in which they live. Eric has provided testimony before courts, United Nations Human Rights Commission. He's written a couple of reports, even with me, about children in Vietnam and the obligations of the federal government in the United States to follow our own laws when we do work overseas. So as you'll see now, I'll stop, Eric brings enormous energy, creativity, dedication, vast array of skill to disability rights. But what sets him apart in my mind, and why I'm so excited and truly touched that he is here today, is his passionate commitment, unwavering personal devotion to the struggle of people with disabilities, and because he cares. The struggle, by the way, is hardly over. And I hope that at the end of this presentation, each of you will take some time to think about what you can do personally. This is not only a political, international human rights struggle, it is a personal commitment, for I hope you too. So in the next hour, I hope you'll be as moved by Eric as I've always been throughout the year. So get busy now, help to make the world a better, more fair, safer, and more inclusive place for all. Thank you. I want to introduce Eric.
All right.
And a note of
Thank you, Beyonce. Thank you. Ellie deserves
just a couple of housekeeping things. We had a little glitch with the short video that Eric is going to show that comes with the formal and captions. So we have to show the YouTube version that does have captionings, but I'm great. So we will have, thankfully, sign language interpreters who will hopefully be able to caption or translate and interpret correctly what you see. The second issue is for anyone who has any vision impairments and need audio translation. We're going to grab a seat right here, and Daniel Van Sant has offered to do any audio translating for you and interpreting. So if anyone has to, I feel like I'm making people move, but this is available as well, okay? We're going to stop Eric about 15 minutes before we end, so that we'll have plenty of time for questions and answers, and he'll be around at the end as well. So thank you so much for coming. Eric.
Thank you. Thank you. Beware of who you work as a paralegal for when you're 23 years old. I think we were over dinner last night calculating that it was about 30 years ago that I started working for Arlene. And she's not only been a mentor to me, and when I was trying to decide whether I wanted to go into psychology or law, I ended up going to law school in large part because of the inspiration of Arlene and the great civil rights work that I saw her doing to protect people with mental disabilities back when I was her paralegal. And the collaboration has gone on and on and on for 30 years since you've been here at Syracuse. The Center for Law and Policy, the students that she has sent to me, students who we've sent abroad, we've collaborated with, your students I traveled to Vietnam with, and we've published articles with. We brought activists from Armenia who came here and studied here, went out and saw services in the Syracuse area. So it's a deep pleasure and a privilege to be here after what has really been a 30-year collaboration with Arlene and a 10-year collaboration with the Syracuse Center for Law and Policy. I think I've been here 3 or 4 times, and I hope to be invited back, and really, really do appreciate that. I like to tell the story of the creation of this field in terms of my own vantage point and my own role. Arlene has already started to summarize that history that we collaborated on together. You know, when I went to work for the Mental Health Law Project, I mean, ironically, again, for many of you students early on in your careers, if I hadn't done really poorly on the LSAT and had to bide some time before getting in, we never would have had that experience. You never know what twists and turns of your own experience. Not only did I meet inspiring lawyers like Arlene and work on those big impact litigation cases, but perhaps the most important experience of that was that all the lawyers at the Mental Health Law Project were so busy on the impact litigation, and they were known as one of the leading organizations protecting the rights of people, that they didn't have time to do direct services or take the calls from the public. And there I was, 23 years old. They put a telephone in front of me and said, all right, when the world calls in, you get to talk to them. And it was an incredible experience for me, hearing firsthand what life was like, the firsthand stories of people locked up in American psychiatric hospitals, hearing the stories of homeless people who scrounged that dime back then using payphones to call me to find out and how their rights could be protected. And spending many, many hours. As a human rights activist, I go around the world and I hear individual testimonies. And hearing those individual testimonies and hearing I couldn't do this work without those very human stories. It's so essential to get out into the field and to talk, but it was really that first experience of taking those phone calls that educated me. I saw the many people, the irony of the many people who desperately needed services who were denied them, and the people who were given services that they did not want. And that lack of respect for choice, individual choice, and how you lead your life, and having the state intrude upon you is one that I have now traveled in 36 countries around the world, and those messages that I received over the telephone, those sense of the dehumanizing effect of having your individual choices not recognized is so absolutely fundamental. I can still hear those voices on the telephone, and that is what I have seen when I travel to Mexico or Ukraine or Vietnam, and I talk to people in institutions. There are enormous cultural differences. I believe very much of mental health and mental illness as a social construct, and people may understand mental illness in different ways in different societies, and yet hearing the individuals, what people want, they want to be part of society, they want to make their own choices, they want to choose who they associate with, and ultimately children who need to grow up with families. And that is a universal that I have seen. The most painful experiences that I have seen around the world are those experiences of families who are being broken up. It's so easy to blame parents who put their kids in institutions, and yet around the world, the universal that I've seen is where societies are not welcoming, where schools are not accessible, where services are not available, where mental illness or intellectual disabilities or any kind of disability is stigmatized. When a child with a disability is born, parents are told, put your child in an institution before you become too emotionally attached to them. And unfortunately, that is going on in the world today. We've personally witnessed it. I was just in Ukraine last year, and I was there. They were doing a documentary. I had a video camera, and in the institution, just an absolutely heartbreaking story that we ended up actually capturing on tape. A mother who was an English teacher from Lviv was saying goodbye to her, I think, 5 or 6 year old daughter. She had desperately tried to keep her daughter, who had an intellectual disability. Her father, when she refused to give up the daughter when the child was born, the father abandoned her. didn't want to be associated with a child with disability. She had desperately tried to maintain her teaching job. Her grandmother, the child's grandmother, helped keep the kid, but it became too much of a burden. The authorities said, put the child in an institution. And she said, the doctor told me that because of her intellectual disability, she would not even know that I was her mother, and she'd never know the difference between being in the institution or living with me. And so it really doesn't matter that I'm putting her in. And I could see her rationalizing as the child had her arms around her mother and was holding her, and it was absolutely perfectly clear that this child loved her mother and knew exactly what was going on, and she had to give up that child. A truly painful experience. For me, the journey began. I had studied psychology in college. I volunteered in a psychiatric facility, found the experience dehumanizing, only learned the language of rights when I went to work for Arlene at the Mental Health Law Project. But when I went to law school, it really was, for me, a transformative experience. I signed up for a class in international human rights, and my professor in human rights was an Argentine activist who was himself a former detainee in Argentina during the Dirty War, a guy by the name of Juan Mendez, who is now the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights. And he heard about my background in mental health, and when we were going around the room to pick seminar papers, he actually walked up to me and said, Eric, I'd appreciate if you would write an article on human rights and mental health, because I have not seen anything on that written. And I said, okay, seminar paper, I've got some background, I'll do this. And I went and I researched the subject, and the research was shocking for me to see, because there was absolutely nothing on disability rights and human rights. There was nothing on mental health and international human rights. What there was at the time, and this was 1989 when the Soviet Union was crumbling, were reports about the placement of political dissidents in Soviet psychiatric hospitals. That it was one way they discredited people who spoke out against the state, was to call them mentally ill and lock them up in institutions. And the Soviet Union had been held accountable. The State Department had sent a delegation. Amnesty International had sent a delegation. The World Psychiatric Association had sent a delegation. And they went into those institutions, and they described in detail what they found in these 1,000-bed facilities, where people could be locked up without due process, where once placed in the institution, they may never see the light of day, that they were crowded into rooms with little activity, where they were forcibly given these horrible psychotropic drugs that sedated them. And yet, what was about these reports, they identified, well, there was one dissident in here, and there's a horrible human rights abuse going on because this dissident has been put in with 1,000 mentally ill people, and it was as if they were unaware that those 1,000 mentally ill people in the same facility also had rights. And I, who had worked for Arlene on impact litigation to try to close down abusive institutions in Alabama and Washington, D.C., it looked a lot like those very same facilities. We had come a long way. We had developed legal protections and a hearing, and you can't lock up a person unless you go through a certain due process. And yet, in the end, being locked up in those facilities, there was an incredible universal, and I'll show you some videos of what we've seen around the world. When I studied the international human rights principles, what is amazing is that the very core concept of international human rights is so relevant here. The international human rights law really derives from that period after the Second World War, where people were put in concentration camps, the trials of the Nazi doctors who conducted experiments on people. And the concept of international human rights is that there are certain higher principles, there are certain core elements of law that we are going to apply to any country of the world, where it's not, your doctors cannot experiment on people without their consent. You can't put people away, and it's not okay to just obey orders if they say that certain human beings are not human beings and they can be written off and killed. And the idea that mental health and social policies are issues that are up to governments. It is core to international law that state sovereignty needs to be recognized, that everyone can develop their own mental health policies and education policies and social policies, and out of respect for local cultures, we have to each develop our own government in our own way, but that the basic humanity of people cannot be thrown away is absolutely critical. And that these laws, and this was before there was a disability convention, that there are protections against discrimination. They apply to people with disabilities. That protections against torture and inhuman treatment. If you are going to give someone treatment that causes them intense pain, that the basic principle applies. Amnesty International had written a report about the use of electroconvulsive therapy without anesthesia. ECT, many of you know what it is, a treatment for depression. It's controversial in the United States because it causes amnesia, and yet we use it with anesthesia. In Romania, Amnesty International found people were given electric shocks as a form of treatment with no anesthesia. So here was government authorities inflicting intense pain on subjects, and the analyst at Amnesty International said, well, this raises medical ethical issues, but unlike those doctors in the Soviet Union who were doing it to repress dissidents, these doctors actually were trying to help. They were trying to provide the best available treatment to people with mental illness to alleviate their depression. Well, no. When the state inflicts pain, subjects you, a person in detention, to electric shock, that is torture, whether or not the doctors are trying to help. And those core principles need to be applied. So that's what I wrote in that paper, and that paper has ended up being the legal framework for the work that I've done for 20 years. I never imagined that the UN would actually adopt a disability convention. I got a small grant to set up an organization that would go around the world, and modeled on what Amnesty International did, I thought we could go in, expose some abuses. I planned to do it as a temporary thing before I went on to my real career. And I figured that if we could expose those abuses, the world would understand, Amnesty and Human Rights Watch and all the big groups would adopt disability policies, and I could go on. What I found was truly horrifying, because as bad and depressing as the American mental health system was, my first place I ever visited, and you'll see some of these in the video, I went to Mexico, the Samuel Ramirez Hospital, where people were held naked, surrounded by barbed wire, fed on the floor, eating off of the floor. The most hellish experience you could imagine, total dehumanization. In the Republic of Georgia just last year, in a facility, ironically, with a little plaque on the front saying, you know, gift of the people of the United States of America, in the Tbilisi Infants House, we found children with disabilities who were dying. 1 out of 3 children died every year in this facility. Many of them had hydrocephaly. We asked, what about the treatment? And they said, oh, well, the doctors have determined that they're already damaged, so they don't get medical treatment. Not only, you know, hydrocephaly is something that with a small amount of intervention, a shunt, something that could easily be provided in the Republic of Georgia, their lives could have been saved. They were allowed to die a slow, painful death. They weren't even given pain medication. Time and time again, when I've been in institutions, we were in Turkey, and they asked about the dental care. We were told that they used pliers to take out the teeth of children because children with disabilities didn't feel pain. So under international human rights law, is it acceptable to write off people as human beings? Is it acceptable to pull out teeth with pliers without anesthesia because people with disabilities don't feel pain? And I believe at some level it comes down to that very lesson that I learned picking up the telephone at the Mental Health Law Project, and that was talking to people and listening to people. Because we later found that in Turkey, for example, this process of unmodified ECT, electroshock without anesthesia, which was widely practiced in Turkey, just so happens that it's widely practiced in India and Japan to this day. some of our unfinished business. We've got to get our Japan project going. But in Turkey, the Turkish Psychiatric Association, when we raised them, said, well, ECT causes, the way it works, don't you know, you're not medical, it causes a seizure and you lose consciousness. And so people with disabilities don't feel the pain. And so it's really not a problem to give them ECT without anesthesia. We went and we talked to the people. Radical idea, it never occurred to them. We went, there was an association of people with disabilities in the country, and we asked them. And it's true, first of all, that most people who got the practice couldn't remember it happening. But what they could remember was being on the ward and hearing the screams coming out of the ECT room of the people for whom it was subject. And I could tell you, whether they remembered the pain or not, they were terrified of being locked up in any psychiatric facility because that was routine. They gave it not only to people with depression, people with schizophrenia, they gave it to young children, 13, 14-year-olds. They found out it was the best way to bring about passive compliance. But we also found some people who did remember it and remember the tortured feeling of being strapped down and subject to electric shock. And when we went back and talked to some doctors and did the research literature, some people who are given this electric shock never have seizures. Some people for whom the electric shock happens, there's a delay of 15 to 20 seconds. Well, 20 seconds of full-scale electricity is something that no person should ever experience. And then there is a kind of a philosophical question of, is it okay to subject people to pain even if they don't remember it later? Well, under international human rights law, I would argue that it's not. So those are some of the challenges that we have faced. In some ways, the standard human rights model of naming and shaming has been tremendously successful. After we exposed the abuses in Turkey, 10,000 people a year who were being subject to this practice, it was stopped. What we have found is that bringing about the bigger social change of closing institutions and integrating people into the community has been much, much harder. We can end the most egregious abuses through exposure, but long-term change really does require sustained advocacy. So the great majority of my work has actually been training and supporting local activists to bring change in their countries. In the years that I've been doing this work, we've actually created 7 different organizations in different countries that are working to bring about change in their own society, and most of those organizations are led by people with disabilities themselves. So starting advocacy by people with disabilities in Kosovo, we set up an organization led by people with intellectual disabilities. And I can tell you the stereotypes that those people were able to shatter just by standing up and speaking out for themselves was incredible. In Mexico, we set up the Colectivo Chucan that has worked to bring together former psychiatric patients, and they are a powerful force. But we have also found that there are entrenched interests who oppose change. There are labor unions of staff who work at institutions who don't want to lose their job. And unfortunately, and this is perhaps the most disturbing find, is that it is not just ignorance, it's not just inertia, it's not just financial interests, but that there is actually a profit motive we have found time and time again of people who would actually exploit people with disabilities. In the Guatemala psychiatric facility, we found that people were locked up in this dangerous facility. There's a prison next door. They took the psychiatric patients and they trafficked them for sex into the prison next door. That the staff took money from outsiders. Once you've got a locked up group of people, well, you can make a little money on that by taking money from outsiders. In Ukraine, where we found 200,000 children in orphanages, it turns out that the orphanages are themselves feeders for much of the trafficking that's going on in Eastern Europe. In Mexico, we found an institution, a small 37-bed facility. It was there, they had legal authority to lock people up because they had a disability. But once you lock people up and no one knows what's going on, we found that women had been brought into this facility and essentially used as sex slaves. So there's a financial interest in doing it. And so we've had to use anti-trafficking law. We've had to train legal authorities to go out and fight that. But perhaps the most disturbing at all is seeing the forces of well-meaning, good-intentioned international donors who think that they are helping and who have in fact ended up perpetuating abuse in much of the world. I mentioned at the beginning the Republic of Georgia. The U.S. Agency for International Development gave $1 billion to the Republic of Georgia after they fought a little war with Russia. And they gave that money to UNICEF, and one of their goals, laudably, was to close down orphanages. They had more than 100 orphanages in this small country. But UNICEF said, well, there are no services for children with disabilities, so let's take the non-disabled kids and close down their orphanages as quickly as possible, and then we'll come back later for the kids with disabilities, although, of course, since those are crumbling facilities, we'll have to rebuild them. No one checked to see if they were getting medical care in those facilities, so they rebuilt the institutions for children with disabilities. They closed down the orphanages, kids without disabilities. And by failing to create any community services for children with disabilities, there was a pipeline into adult facilities. And the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers contributed by rebuilding the adult facilities as well. So the U.S. government did this, and we have found the World Bank is in the process of doing the exact same thing in Ukraine. We were able to get report language by the U.S. Congress to say that the U.S. approach was discriminatory in violation of U.S. law. And we got AID to give us a grant, and we're now working in Georgia to reverse that policy and integrate those people into the community. But it's not just big donors, it's actually private donors. And one of the worst and most pervasive problems we've found around the world, one of the great gateways to lifetime institutionalization, are the existence of orphanages. There are 8 to 10 million children around the world in orphanages, as well as adult psychiatric hospitals and nursing homes, who are put away with the belief that these are poor, long-lost children and there's no better place for them, and wouldn't it be nice if we created an orphanage to protect them? Well, the United States has had a policy against orphanages for more than 100 years. Psychological research has shown that every child, whether they have a disability or not, has emotional needs to grow up with a family, to people for whom they can form deep emotional attachments. And that if you do not, you can have the cleanest and most beautiful orphanage with the best trained staff and wonderful disability services. But if you cannot form emotional attachments to individuals, that will cause psychological damage. It will lead to developmental delays. And unfortunately, as we have found, people not protected by families are more easily exploited, abused, and tortured. And yet, many, many donors assume, well, these are the children who are most in need in the world. There are, you can't blame people for thinking they're helping the children who are in fact most in need. The statistics show that 90 to 98% of children in the world's orphanages actually have families, like the woman in Ukraine who was putting her child in an institution because she had no choice. The great majority of children are placed there because of the disability of the child or the disability of the parent or poverty or other forms of discrimination, and those orphanages generate more disabilities. So while there are enormous challenges abroad, I believe, and we have come to realize, that real reform is going to happen until we in the United States and in donor countries start to change. CNN Heroes every year has a slot for the young orphanage provider, the American hero who goes abroad and sets up a new orphanage. There was just one in Nepal. In Nepal, it's a perfect example of all the ways in which misplaced good intentions can go wrong. If you scroll back 10 years in Nepal, there were 3 orphanages. Then there became a new movement called voluntourism, where people want to go abroad and help out and volunteer in an orphanage. And the number of orphanages has exploded, and there are now more than 500 orphanages in Nepal. And if you're a poor family with a kid and a foreigner comes in and says, well, we'll pay money to be able to take care of your kid, and these orphanages become big business, Of course, poor parents feel that maybe we're doing the right thing for our child and putting our child in an orphanage. But in the end, if you had a foreigner coming in from Nepal and they were going to take care of your child, would you let a foreigner who was unvetted give a bath to your son or daughter, or come in and volunteer for a couple hours and then leave? There is tremendous opportunity for abuse, and what we have to do is to educate and expose the world to the ways in which ultimately people with disabilities are the same as everyone else. We cannot put them away. We have to recognize their core humanity, because I believe that what is essentially happening is the ultimate dehumanization, that the only way to justify putting these people away is to view them as less than human being, and that the human rights movement is not only saying that every human life is sacred, every human life has value and cannot be written off, but that ultimately human rights is about treating people as human beings. And I believe that the disability community and the disability rights movement has something fundamental to teach the human rights movement about that. And that's what the challenge is. And it is still, we now have a disability convention, and the challenge is alive today. I'm going to pause and show a short video, a 10-minute piece that ABC News did about our work in Mexico, and then we'll have a little time to have some question and answers.
10 years ago, I traveled to Mexico to investigate allegations of horrific human rights abuses in state-run psychiatric institutions. What we found then was shocking: the wretched lives of forgotten people. And now, 10 years later, we returned with our original partners, the nonprofit group Disability Rights International. They released their report, Abandoned and Disappeared, today. Tonight, Nightline investigates. Mexico City on the eve of its bicentennial. But we haven't come here for the celebration. We're here to go inside places where few people ever go by choice: Mexico's psychiatric institutions. Our investigation began 10 years ago when we went to this psychiatric facility just outside Mexico City called Ocaranza. Okay, we're in. It was a notorious place where we witnessed patients without clothing in the freezing cold. All we could do was bring this woman a blanket.
Is she all right?
There were feces and urine everywhere, the stench unbearable.
And there's no towels. And it's nauseating.
And we were stunned to see medications distributed from a cardboard box by a patient.
Unbelievable.
At another hospital in Guadalajara, we found children tied and bound, even leashed to a window grate. After our report, the government vowed to drastically alter the system. We decided to go back and see if they had. 10 years ago, when we went to Mexico, it was clear there are human rights abuses taking place there.
Very serious abuses.
Eric Rosenthal is the executive director of Disability Rights International. We worked with him on our original report and teamed up again this fall. In the intervening 10 years, has the system been cleaned up?
It has not. I mean, what is shocking is that it's as if time stood still.
In fact, we were shocked to find the same kids and the same mats rocking back and forth. We recognized Marie Flores, tied up the last time we were there. We're told she's mentally retarded. Experts say people like her shouldn't need to be institutionalized. Another young woman sitting with her legs crossed 10 years ago, found just as we'd last seen her, but this time chewing on a bottle cap. No therapy, no treatment plan, no hope. How bad would you say the human rights violations taking place here in Mexico in these mental facilities are?
I think, frankly, they're among the worst that I've ever seen any place in the world.
San Francisco-based psychiatrist Robert Oken worked with us 10 years ago and has traveled the world examining conditions in mental hospitals. So this is warehousing.
This is total warehousing. Well, they're just abandoned. They're the castaways of society.
Treated without dignity, many of them heavily medicated. Macario was here on our last visit, too. He has epilepsy and lives with his arms tied behind his back.
It's torture to tie a person down and leave them strapped to a wheelchair for a lifetime.
Torture has a very specific legal meaning. Do
It
you mean
does.
it in that sense?
We mean it in the strict sense of the term. It is a violation of Article 1 of the UN Convention Against Torture.
A psychiatrist here tells us with early intervention, all of the patients here would have had a totally different life. Rosenthal's group investigated 19 other Mexican institutions. In this one, they saw kids all jumbled together, some with disabilities, others, they say, with no apparent infirmities, like these lively toddlers.
There's no oversight, there's no monitoring, there's no quality control. It's a black hole.
Not only kids get lost in the black hole of the system. I wanted to find out what happened to all those patients I'd met a decade ago. That first horrible adult hospital was closed after our last report, and we discovered that 60 patients were dumped here at the Samuel Ramirez Hospital, where Dr. Cesar Benuelos is in charge. Even he acknowledges while the facility is cleaner, the plight of the patients has not been improved.
They just put them in different facilities in order to appear like the transformed institution.
You're saying nothing really changed for the people.
No.
Dr. Benuelos came to the hospital 3 years ago and has inherited many of the problems. He agreed to take us behind the locked gates.
Okay, let's see something like hell.
You're the director here and you describe it as hell?
You are going to see. I'm not lying.
See, I mean, you look at this man's eyes and he tears up with human contact. I mean, you know, one wonders how long it's been since someone's held his hand. In ward after ward, we see patients lying naked, unattended, rocking.
The rocking is a kind of psychological impairment. Some of the other, the moaning, it's partially a psychological response to lack of human contact.
This man is kept in isolation, we're told, because he bites. We didn't see the signs of aggression, but we did notice his urine-soaked pants. They have only 10 clean sets of clothes for 13 patients, a nurse explains. When you go home at the end of the day, how do you feel?
Smashed against the floor.
Smashed against the floor.
Yeah.
It was here, deep inside the hospital, where we met Juan Carlos. Perhaps no single person represents the agony of this place better than he does. Sent as a child from another institution, he lives in this red helmet with his arms tied behind his back. And he wears the helmet because he constantly hits his head, the director said. Dr. Benuelos admits it's not a good solution, but it's all they can do. In fact, he points out Juan Carlos is so used to living like this that he becomes agitated when the restraints are off, as we saw for ourselves.
This is the first sign that the crisis is coming.
People who look this dysfunctional really were not this dysfunctional when they came. Life in the institution has led to a deterioration. Moreover, even the people that you see here after years of institutionalization could be helped if there were more staff in a more integrated setting.
Can you tell how many of these people have been made worse by being institutionalized?
All of them.
All of them.
Almost all of them.
You're taking a big risk to say all this publicly, aren't you? Personal risk.
I just want to be honest, that's all. And if somebody in the government got angry or mad or something, I'm really sorry. But it is our reality right now.
And it needs to change.
Absolutely.
Because now the hospitals that are supposed to make people better only make them worse. What percentage of this population could survive outside an institution with appropriate support services in the community?
I think the vast, vast majority could survive with a lot of one-to-one attention in the community.
But isn't that too expensive? especially for a country that spends less on its entire mental health system than it takes to operate just one U.S. hospital. It's expensive, though.
There's no amount of poverty in Mexico that could explain 2 staff members trying to take care of 37 clients. There's no poverty that could explain this degree of abandonment.
There are small glimmers of humanity, a gift of twigs and grass to Dr. Oken.
This is about all they have to give.
You okay?
We can't help but wonder, 10 years from now, will it still be the same for people like Juan Carlos? We try to comfort him.
He has the ability to be soothed, though.
Yes.
He's scared. He's just frightened.
Frightened to death.
But living in hell.
For its part, the Mexican government has pledged to support disability rights at the UN. We spoke to an official at the Mexican Health Ministry who acknowledges that there are serious problems in these institutions, but claims that nearly $8 million new dollars have been allocated for the Ramirez facility and community services. We'll stay on the story. We'll be right back with tonight's Sign of the Times.
Well, those images I know are very, very particularly difficult for me, the lesson that after advocacy in Mexico for all those years, many of the abuses are still continuing. As I said earlier, it's very much easier to stop governments from actively doing things. In Mexico, we found people locked in cages, and we got a policy adopted to stop them from locking them in cages. We just documented that 40% of women with psychosocial disabilities in our sample had been forcibly sterilized, and they changed that policy immediately upon exposure. But getting a country like Mexico and many of the other countries with very dysfunctional governments to transform their service systems is extremely difficult. We are now bringing a case. We brought one in Guatemala, and we're bringing the second case shortly, modeled on the Supreme Court case in the United States of Olmstead versus LC, which says that it's a form of discrimination to treat people in a segregated environment who are capable of living in the community. So now we are taking a long-term legal approach to suing the government of Mexico to push them for community integration. There have been enormous changes in Mexico in terms of the development of the advocacy movement, but as an activist, I personally can only be heartbroken to see the abuses continuing in this way. Any thoughts or questions about the video or anything I've said? Yes.
So I watched the video and I'm sort of reminded of Tika Follows and sort of the activism that generated.
Right.
But I think the situation in the U.S. is a bit more complex right now. The average length of stay in the hospital is now 10 days. You have advocacy organizations like NAMI actively campaigning for more hospital beds for kids who can't safely survive and maintain tenure in the community. You have an active campaign right now in New York to reduce what they're calling unnecessary hospitalizations by 25%. And really just radically defunding general hospitals, psych wards that are relatively humane, relatively safe, without danger. So there's also this kind of problem that's happening where the APA estimates that 7% of the uptake that we see in incarceration is due to a lack of hospital beds. We have three times the number of people in incarceration than we have in hospitals in the US.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's a counter narrative here too.
Absolutely.
I think you're not, or I'd like to hear you speak to.
Right.
Certainly the abuses that they're pointing to are deeply concerning, deeply troubling.
Right.
But there's been a sort of, I wonder if we have gone too far in sort of eliminating a site of care, that if we thought more about kind of how to make inpatient stays more humane, could actually provide a really important part that seems to be sort of missing.
Yep. A lot of stuff to unpack in your question there. Let me start by saying one of the things that I have done as a small new organization in a new field, because there is a disability rights movement in the United States, because there is advocacy here, we've tried to actually stay out of doing work in the U.S. Because we're filling such an enormous gap and there's such a shortage abroad that we do very little work in the United States. And I would submit that in the rest of the world, they are very much where we were in the 1950s. We had 500,000, oops, did the sound system just kick in? We had 500,000 people in institutions in the United States. If you look at our population doubling, it would be the equivalent of 1 million. I don't think we give ourselves enough credit for the fabulous, fabulous success that we've had. Yes, we have failures, but the fact that the vast majority of people whose lives were thrown away, with particularly the population with intellectual disabilities, for whom the transition, I think, has been much more effective, but also for people with psychiatric, no one would want to go back to that. And the era of the asylum is alive and well in much of the world. And so in terms of what our worldwide challenge is, absolutely. In terms of where we are in the United States and where things ought to be, I can certainly say there is no doubt, and I firmly believe in the community integration model, and I believe Article 19 says every person with a disability has a right to live in the community with choices equal to others, and that the services need to be provided to make that possible. And if we haven't provided those services, who are we to say that the need for institutions is largely a product of our failure to provide? There may be, and we could argue, and the number of angels on the head of a pin, as to whether there may be one individual out there who would be actually better off in an institution than in the community, but that's a luxury when you haven't even come close to providing the community services that are necessary. And so I believe, let's start with the easy part, and the easy part actually is the lack of money. Let's provide the care that we need to do before we start forcibly putting people into places that they don't want to be. That's my personal perspective on it. I can tell you, we have adopted a worldwide campaign to bring an end to the institutionalization of children. We've focused specifically on children because there the evidence is extremely powerful that all children need to grow up in a family and that no institution is ever a good thing psychologically for a child, even if there is a small group who need medical care that may be better off provided in a hospital. There is no doubt that having a family matters to those children as they do to all other children. And ironically, one of the big challenges that we face in fighting the fact that donors give money to institutions abroad is they say, well, how can you justify arguing for a total closure of institutions abroad when we put children in institutions in the United States? We've had a policy against the orphanage for 100 years, but the reality is that many children with disabilities are in fact placed in institutions. And Daniel was telling me that in Iowa, where there are, a rural environment where there's limited money, it's a lot easier to put people in a congregate setting. But again, it's about the ease of providing those services rather than the fact that they are good. When I leave here, I'm going to speak to a major donor in New York City tomorrow morning who funds human rights work in the United States, and we're going to be making the pitch to them to actually we've done one other project in the United States, to do another project to work on looking at children in institutions and what could be done to shift funding away and incentives away from institutionalization and support community care, because I believe the challenges are very much here as well. Yes?
Would you mind, I really appreciate.
Just want everyone has to speak up so the card people can hear. Yes. Oh, even better. Press, if you could press it so it's green in front of you. And then thank you, Joan.
So thank you for joining us and thank you for your work on the convention, especially. Because that's what I best know,
Sure.
Not because it's better than other work that you have done. I am very interested in what the model looks like when you work in other countries, when you're pushing deinstitutionalization. what model do you offer to governments as an alternative to institutionalization? How does that work on the ground?
Well, the models are really not that different abroad than they are here in the United States. I mean, once you've demonstrated that it's not the disability, a person with just about any disability can be served, it's about how do you provide those community supports in other countries the same way that you do in the United States. Many countries do not have highly trained professionals at all, right? And so there is often an argument, how can we create community services when we don't have these highly trained professionals? And yet, if you step back and think, if you're going to be not getting any professional services in an institution or not getting any professional services in the community, you might as well not get those services in the community where you'll also have social contact and interaction with the world. So what you'll have is access to parents, access to family, access to other forms. It turns out that in some ways, where labor is less expensive in other countries, it actually may be easier to create community services than in the United States, where labor and human contact is so important. So in terms of providing housing, providing a person to check in on you, those are the absolute core of what is needed. And we have found in the Republic of Georgia, there are actually models of people with some fairly severe disabilities that we've helped create, of foster care where we've gotten kids with disabilities out into the community. And yes, don't mean to undervalue the importance of highly trained professionals and getting people the supports they need, but it is my view, and I confess I've become more radical on this the more time I spend in the area. On the one hand, we deinstitutionalized very quickly in the United States, dumped people out, and it is argued, many people have said, that people have ended up on the streets because of our lack of planning and lack of community care. At some level, of course, don't close institutions overnight, create community supports, have a carefully planned transition. That goes without saying. And yet, time and time again, what I have seen is the lack of planning and the lack of community services as the excuse for not dealing with the institutions. And 2/3 of the countries of the world, if you look on some bookshelf in the Ministry of Social Policy, they've got their plan for deinstitutionalization, and maybe a decade later you come back and it's moved forward 1 inch. So that becomes the excuse for not doing anything. And I believe it is very disingenuous to argue that they're nice and safe in the institution until we can get around to create the community services. And one of the things that we are trying to show is that they are not nice and safe in the institution. And it's not just the psychological studies which show the psychological damage, it is danger. It is danger from people who exploit them and rape them and beat them and deprive them of medical care. It is a dangerous thing. So what we are trying to is light the fire under those service systems to bring about change as quickly as possible.
Can I chime in here as
Yes.
well, Eric? I just want to chime in to respond. Is there also those countries which are the less affluent countries that haven't developed the systems and institutions as we know here in our country and other countries? And those countries and those cultures are interesting to me because they are heading towards creating a whole new system of institutions. I know in Vietnam, when we worked on writing their disability law, they said, well, how do you provide support in the community? And we said, well, how do you take care of your older people, your older relatives? They live with their families.
Right. And as it turns out,
And I was going to say, so how can you provide support for people with disabilities living with the families using the model that's indigenous and familiar to you? And I think that's the sense that it's not only what we did right and wrong that we can share, but also what other cultures can teach us about different norms that challenge some of our practices.
And the other thing we found in Vietnam was that the major international donor there are the Japanese. Japan has one of the highest rates of institutionalization in the world, and they were telling us they want to create nice big psychiatric hospitals like they have in Japan. So it's happening again and again. If we can educate those international donors, it will go a long way.
I don't want to crowd out other, but I'm less concerned about highly trained professionals as I am about attitudinal shifts and the kind of cultural shift that's required in education campaigns to make the general population, which we still need here too, right?
Yes, well, the attitudinal change, again, every single country I've ever gone to in the world, someone pulls me aside and said, I've heard your pitch and I've read the convention and I know that community integration is a good thing and you were very successful in the United States. Not as successful as they think, but very successful. But we have this special cultural problem here. We have terrible, mentally ill people are either considered possessed or dangerous or something is wrong with them, or we'll never be able to adopt children out of institutions because biology and bloodlines are very important in our culture. There's always some cultural explanation for why it can't work, and those cultural explanations are remarkably similar in every different part of the world that I've ever been to. And I believe we don't wait around to change culture. What this comes down to, these are fundamental human rights. And that is the essence of what anti-discrimination law is about, protecting those rights. Those people have a right to be part of society, and the cultural change will follow. And when people with disabilities are living in the communities and going to schools and people realize that they're not as horrifying as they thought that they were, that's when the culture changed. That's what happened in the United States, and that's what's happening everywhere else. Yes?
So I'll try to project my voice a little bit.
And press the button in front of you, are you ready to take, if you press that button and it turns green, that's a microphone. So,
Oh, goody. Thank you, Arlene. Thank you for being here. It's a real honor to hear you and to be present for what you're saying. And I'm Diane, and I was just wondering a couple of things. I think when we try to balance between the ethical complexities of cultural relativism and the limits of cultural relativism to which you were just referring, and then the ways in which numerous times people from the so-called global north, from predominantly white educational and institutional contexts, go to places where there are predominantly darker complected people being depicted in mainstream media representations, as we've seen here. How do we have a nuanced and critical and ethical exploration of how to talk about that in a way that's sensitive to issues of anti-racism and transnational feminisms? That's the first thing I want to ask you. And the second thing is, in this country, I think there's a deep imbrication between psychiatrization and the prison industrial complex, which has definitely been fomented in the Southwest and in numerous other places, even in specifically Texas and Arizona, but that's technically Southwest the latter. And the ways in which the financial motivation that you're referencing earlier is part of that is disturbing to me at levels I can't even articulate unless I want insomnia more than I already have it. And then the third thing is that on my way here, what we were doing at the Disability Cultural Center was fashioning the latest language for the annual vigil in remembrance of people with disabilities murdered by their family members and caregivers, which is March 1st, 2016, in solidarity with ADAPT, Disabled in Action, the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, and an array of other Not Dead Yet, et cetera, disability rights organizations. And I think that the way the media in the United States continuously in a mainstream context represents that this is a really, what else are people expected to do with these kids and with these young adults? I mean, in such a burdensome situation. And I feel like all these things are interconnected in terms of how the rights and worth of people with disabilities continue to be supplanted by other things. So any of that you want to respond to, those are some of my thoughts. Thank you.
Yep. Well, I'm a very practical person. And so just to cut through to the practicalities, I'm very aware that wherever I go, I'm perceived, as an American. And if I'm going to bring about change, and I do so as I'm a white male educated guy from the United States, you should listen to what I say. I'm not going to get very far. And I certainly was not as quite aware of that as when, the abuses came out in Iraq and Abu Ghraib, and I was in a Romanian orphanage, and the guy said, "Who are you to tell us what to do when you're torturing people in Iraq?" And so certainly what the United States does abroad, whether I agree with them or not in terms of standing up for human rights in areas not directly related to is extremely important. And so there's a close interrelationship between us as a country recognizing and protecting rights, be it in our own streets. The other side of it is when I talk about deinstitutionalization, and psychiatrists from other countries say, we have seen the homeless mentally ill on the heating grates of your cities. who are you to tell us to deinstitutionalize? So whether it's Abu Ghraib or homeless people abandoned in the United States, I as an American have to work through that. By the same token, change happens when the stakeholders are involved, and that is core. It's written into the Disability Convention. It recognizes that people with disabilities themselves have to be a part. They have to be developing rights. They have to be developing programs. They have to be part of the solutions. And so who are the people who end up saying, you are not a legitimate voice for human rights? When I go to Mexico or Georgia or Vietnam, well, it's usually the people in power who are using that as an excuse to silence me, when in fact I speak to the people with disabilities and I speak to the people who are locked up, and I work with former psychiatric patients, and we can play an enormous role. And very often, you know, there is an activist group meeting in someone's living room, and it's been there well before I ever arrived, but no one ever paid attention. And if my presence can help bring the mainstream media in, well, I'm damn well going to use the mainstream media to get that done. So whatever ABC News interest is in commercially doing shocking presentations, the activists in country appreciate the fact that we can work together and we can shine the light of public attention, because frankly, it's the mainstream media, in as big and bold and exploitative as it's going to be, that has brought about change bigger and faster than anything I've ever seen. And so we've worked very hard to use that. It's, you know, laws are great, and as a lawyer you can bring cases that are going to take 4 years, but getting it on national and international television is what brings about change, and that's what we do. Other questions?
In the light of the adoption of CRPD in countries that have ratified, in your experience, has that changed governmental attitudes, or are they just merely giving lip service?
Yeah. Really excellent, fabulous question. On the one hand, I've seen tremendous changes since the adoption of the CRPD. Number one, it's become a checklist item that every agency has to look at. That's a good thing. Countries have been reforming their laws at a rapid pace. That's a good thing. But we have to recognize that the legal changes are the starting point. They're necessary but not sufficient. I was just 2 weeks ago in the Republic of Georgia, where they adapted, you know, one of the most innovative provisions of the Disability Convention is Article 12, which recognizes a core right to legal capacity. Many governments' legal systems have what's called guardianship, a system of substituted judgment where people's choices are taken away by guardianship, and new systems have been created under the convention to create what's called supported decision-making. So in Georgia, where we got one of the most progressive guardianship laws, or at least supported decision, that replaced guardianship with supported decision-making. And I went into institution, and I met a woman who was called, this woman has mental retardation, I was told, and she had been admitted, and she was now very violent, and her child had been taken away from her. And so I asked what had happened, and they said, oh, well, we now have a supported decision-making regime, and so here, why don't you come meet the supported decision-maker? And so under the new supported decision-making regime, I was introduced to the staff maker, who was the official supported decision-maker for this woman who had decided to take away this woman's child. I mean, so in the most painful, awful way, we have to realize that every system has its capacity for abuse, and you can call it all the right things and have all the right laws. And I said, you know, it showed in the record, she has no social skills, she has no ability to communicate, and she never asked to have her child back. Well, if she didn't have any ability to communicate, she didn't ask. Well, I asked what actually happened to this woman, and she was admitted when she was pregnant, and she was very calm during her pregnancy. And when she gave birth, she was brought to the maternity ward of the hospital. And for 4 days, she was in the hospital, and she nursed her child, and she took care of her child. And then they brought her back to the institution, but there was a rule against bringing kids into the institution. So they brought her back, and her child was no longer there, and she became violent after she came back. But then the person who was designated her supported decision maker said, oh, well, she never asked to have her child back. You know, the 1984, so I guess it comes back, well, who was the person who asked about changing attitudes? Again, it is fairly deep. If you have no concept that people can make choices for themselves, that this woman actually had the ability to communicate, and she was communicating through her anger that something was wrong. Those are the subtleties. So it's going to take quite some time as we change attitudes so you can have great compliance with the convention and great laws. But until we understand how to actually communicate with people with disabilities and understand their desires and on an individual level respond to them, we've got a long way to go.
Maybe one more question.
In the back?
Mr. Rosenthal, how do you deal with countries that don't even register children born with severe disabilities as humans?
Yes.
And so they're easy to hide or dispose of.
Absolutely. That is one of the projects that I have more wanted to work on than anything else. And if you've got any spare time, you can help me with it. I mean, I believe that infanticide is one of the great problems. And I've you know, had high government officials telling me, oh, we're way ahead of you because we don't have people with disabilities in our country. You know, I'm sure it's happening on very limited basis. We've had people admit to it. In Georgia, where we found doctors saying we don't provide care because they're already damaged, that was one of the, in 20-some years, one of the rare times that we got people to actually say what we knew to be going on. And there would have to be a pretty sophisticated demographic study on where are the missing people with disabilities and why are they not registered. And it's an extremely valuable and important project that would require a kind of a new mechanism for documenting, and we'd love to do it if we could.
One more?
Yes.
I believe you mentioned, or it might have been in the video, I don't recall. I think it was you, about the orphanages in Nepal and how they've blossomed.
Yeah.
Is there a way to begin to, or have you worked on kind of curbing that paternal kind of?
Yeah. Well, on Nepal, DRI's president, Laurie Ahern, if you do a search, it's on our website. She's written a couple op-eds in the Huffington Post. After she did one op-ed in the Huffington Post, the U.S. State Department put a warning on their website about Americans going to Nepal to beware of any volunteering in any orphanage because there's so much abuse going on. After the CNN Heroes gave out their latest award, she also wrote a critique of the CNN Heroes program. We may never be on CNN ever again after this. So much for the mainstream media. But we are working on that. And that's exactly what our World Campaign is meant to do and why we're educating donors. And it's a big challenge, but it's what we've got to do. Okay, well, thank you very much. Appreciate it.